Hello and welcome back to my Ranking All series. Today we're going to rank all the full-length studio records from Pantera. Pantera is a band with two eras, I guess we could say. The glam and hard rock era with Terry Glaze at the mic, and then the groove metal era with Phil Anselmo fronting the band. Pantera also recently reunited the surviving members Rex Brown and Phil Anselmo, that is, with drummer Charlie Benanti of Anthrax and Ozzy Osbourne's Zakk Wylde on the guitar. So expect a tour here in 2023. Anyhow, today we're going to rank all of their studio albums from the worst stinker to their greatest masterpiece. So don't forget to hit that like button, because now it's time to rank some Pantera records. The worst Pantera record is, in my opinion, the Great Southern Trendkill, an album despite its name was a trendsetter within the metal realm. It's 1996 and Pantera's brand of modern metal has completely taken over, especially in the States, where people collectively seem to have lost their minds when it came to their musical taste. I had lost my interest for the band at this point, so I never bought this record. So when I put together this video, I revisited the album for the first time in 20 years. And I just can't understand what people see in this record. It's just more of that simplistic chugging BS that gives me a headache. And it's not like I'm old and hate aggressive music. I like everything from Black Sabbath to Slayer and Death. And there are a few expressions and sounds within the metal genre that I just can't stand. Whether it's rap metal, new metal, or just metal that is way too cheerful, or softer pop metal and stuff like that. Add to that groove metal. I just don't understand this type of music. For me, this is kinda like your typical grandma's take on metal, that it's just unintelligible noise. Next. In 8th place we have Pantera's last studio album titled Reinventing the Steel, which came out in the year 2000. And that might just be Pantera's legacy. How they reinvented metal with albums like Cowboys from Hell, Vulgar Display of Power and Far Beyond Driven. And when I decided to do this ranking all video, I was quite familiar with their early and mid-era stuff, but I lost my interest for the band with Far Beyond Driven, so I'm not sure if I ever even listened to this album until in the last couple of weeks. For you who watch my channel on a regular basis know my hostility towards modern metal. And this record is a modern metal album, and what I mean by that is that it has this 90s lifeless production, those stomping and bouncy riffs, and a vocalist that sounds more like a hardcore punk vocalist than a metal singer. There's nothing interesting going on here, no cool songs, and the vocals are horrendous. The production likewise, and the disjointed repetitive riffs and drumming really gets on my nerves. And by the way, Kerry King of Slayer plays the lead guitar on the song Goddamn Electric. But despite that, this album is utter garbage. Next. In 7th place we have Far Beyond Driven from 1994. And it's one of those few metal records that went to that number 1 spot on the Billboard's Top 200 list. Quiet Riot's Metal Health also reached that top spot. There might be more, I'm not exactly sure here. And that is quite a remarkable feat for such an extreme record like Far Beyond Driven. And I also think that this album is a piece of garbage. Boring repetitive riffs, a horrible production, and those "hey look at me, I'm a mofo tough guy" vocals are really annoying. The album features songs like Becoming, 5 Minutes Alone, I'm Broken and Planet Caravan. And choosing Planet Caravan as the Black Sabbath song to cover was also a weird choice, since it's one of their softest songs and it has such a dreamy feel to it, which is more or less the opposite of Pantera's sound. But despite that, I think it's the best song on the album, but then again, I'm a huge Black Sabbath fan. It's the only song that Phil Anselmo doesn't completely ruin with this endless tirade of screams. Far Beyond Driven is a terrible record through and through, but unfortunately it sold so well that we had to suffer a few more decades of this modern crap, not only from Pantera but also from all the bands that they influenced. Next. In 6th place we have the band's debut album Metal Magic from 1983. And when you hear this record, it would have been hard to foresee the band's commercial success that happened almost a decade later. This album is a rather dull, glammed up hard rock or heavy metal album. This era of the band is sometimes called glam Terra, simply because Pantera more or less were a completely different band back then compared to the Pantera that took over the charts in the early 90s. This Pantera sounds a bit like a cross between Kiss, Van Halen and Def Leppard or something. Back then it was Terry Glaze that fronted the band, and he's obviously not a screamer like Phil Anselmo. I don't know if it's just me, but I think that Terry sounds a bit like that soul and funk legend Rick James when he sings. And this album is heavily underproduced. The bass is practically unintelligible, the guitars are obnoxiously fuzzy, and the vocals are buried deep within the mix. Most of the songs on this album are rather simplistic, but there are some screaming guitars on this album, so it's not a complete throwaway from a guitar standpoint. And there are also some keyboards used on this record, and the lyrics are kinda cheeky, with some sexual innuendos, like a lot of the glam metal bands did at the time. It seems like the band wants to erase this part of their career. For example, Pantera never reissued these early Terry Glaze fronted albums. Maybe they are ashamed of that glammed up look that they had at the time, because it's a bit of a contrast to the tough guy attitude of their later records. The title track Metal Magic has some cool riffs, but overall I would call this a rather forgettable start of their career. This isn't particularly good, but at least it's not wearing me out like some of their more modern records. Next. In 5th place we have Vulgar Display of Power from 1992, and it's the follow-up to Cowboys from Hell, and sound-wise it's their most similar record. Lots of chugging and bouncing riffs, some aggressive tough guy posturing from Phil Anselmo. Phil kind of stopped using his falsetto vocals around this point. Seems like the guy blew out his voice around this time. Even his speaking voice sounds kinda messed up these days. Vulgar Display of Power includes Pantera classics such as Walk, Fucking Hostile, Mouth for War, some rhythmic and circular riffs repeated to the teeth, and that dry 90s production on top of it. Some people like this style. I see this more as the beginning of that 90s trend that gave us bands like Machine Head, Grip Inc., White Zombie, and in the long run Korn, Lamb of God, Slipknot and bands like that. The whole modern metal era that I dislike so much. I also dislike the production here. The album definitely suffers from the loudness wars, and Phil Anselmo's screaming is just annoying to listen to. Dimebag Darrell is of course a talent, but if I don't like the vocals or the production, I'm not going to listen to the record. And this album was produced during a time when metal was dying, and this dry and thinly produced records with screaming vocals became a thing. For me, metal is bands like Judas Priest, Maiden, Accept, or even thrash, black or death metal. And this was something else, and it just sounded sterile. Next. In 4th place we have Projects in the Jungle from 1984, and this was the band's sophomore release, and it was a clear improvement on the debut. The album is better produced, the vocals are more audible, and the guitars have more speed and impact, which makes the album feel more like a heavy metal album in comparison to Metal Magic. But despite this being a better album than the debut, this wasn't an album that could compete with Power Slave, Defenders of the Faith, The Last in Line and all of those classic 1984 albums. This is still too much of a weird Quiet Riot meets Van Halen record. Just listen to the track In Over My Head with its cheesy chorus and keyboards. It's just too much. But there are however some faster tracks here too, and some decent heavy metal cuts like Out for Blood, Killers or the heavy metal anthem Heavy Metal Rules. Projects in the Jungle was an improvement on Metal Magic, but this wasn't anything to write home about just yet. Next. In 3rd place we have Cowboys from Hell from 1990, and it was time for Pantera to rebrand themselves. Even if Phil Anselmo joined the band on their previous record Power Metal, it was here that Pantera became a household name in metal, and it was here that they ditched the glammy hard rock sound and instead looked towards bands like Slayer, Metallica and Dark Angel for inspiration. But despite the obvious thrash metal influences, Pantera ended up with a record that is generally seen as the starting point for a completely new genre called groove metal, which I guess we can say was co-invented by another band called Exorder. Groove metal drew its influences from thrash metal, but it's often more rhythmic and groovy, and has more of an aggressive approach to the vocals. Fortunately, Phil Anselmo is still singing on this record, unlike the screaming he did on their next couple of records. And there is also a change in the lyrics here, less glam metal themes about sex and life on the wild side, and more about drugs, inner struggles, hate and such. I also find the guitar tone to be a bit weird, to say the least. At times it sounds like a buzzsaw or something, or that they put some weird effects over the guitar. Something weird is going on, and I'm no production wizard, so I have no idea. A lot of people consider this to be a metal classic, and sure, it had a huge impact back in 1990 when it came out. But despite me ranking this as their third best record, I'm not the biggest fan of this album, mostly due to its sound and the negative influence I think it had on metal going forward. Next up we have Power Metal from 1988. Exit Terry Glaze and enter Phil Anselmo. But on this record, Phil Anselmo's vocal style had more similarities to Terry Glaze than his own singing on later Pantera records, I would say. Despite that, I think that Phil's vocals were an improvement on Terry's vocals. There's just way more power in his voice here. In the early days, Pantera released a new album every year. This time it took them 3 years. By 1988, metal had changed quite a bit. Thrash bands like Metallica, Slayer, Anthrax and Megadeth had taken over. But Pantera were still mostly messing around with heavy metal, or power metal like they would have called it. And just like on their previous records, there are a slight improvement on pretty much everything going on here. You can definitely hear Dimebag Darrell had started to find his own style here, since I find this album to be the record that bridges the gap between the early days of the band and the Cowboys from Hell era. Favorite tracks here are the title track Power Metal and Over and Out, a song with a lot of crunchy thrash-like riffs. And there are some corny lyrics on this record too, with PST-88 being the worst. And this was also the band's last release on their own Metal Magic label, which can explain the drastic change of sound on their next album, their big breakthrough record, Cowboys from Hell. Next. The greatest Pantera record is, in my opinion, I Am the Night from 1985. This was the band's third studio album, and the last album to feature the band's original vocalist Terry Glaze, who was fired after this record. A decision I could support since his singing was rather average, even if it also got better by each record. If you haven't heard Terry Glaze, he sounds a bit like a young Vince Neil or Motley Crue or something. I Am the Night also sounds a bit different from the band's first two records, Metal Magic and Projects in the Jungle. Pantera also moved away from that Kiss meets Van Halen kinda sound, and into a more Priest meets Motley Crue influenced sound. I really liked the song Valhalla, which was to this point the best song that the band had written, with its almost speed metal approach. Right on the Edge also has some cool Dimebag riffs, and the title track is also worth mentioning here. But the album ain't perfect. The sappy ballad Forever Tonight ruins the mood for me, and it's definitely one of the worst songs that the band ever recorded, so that one is beyond skippable. But overall, this is a solid album, and a real underrated one as well. Onward they rock, straight to the top. And here I have my full Pantera rank, and I am, as you can guess, perhaps not the biggest Pantera fan, and it's always a bit controversial when I'm not completely sold on a band or a record, but you can't be into everything, so take it easy down in the comment section. And if you're into Pantera, then that is absolutely fine. I used to think that the second half of their career was a bit overrated. And for some reason, they seem to be ashamed of some of their best moments, which I find to be a bit odd. And I definitely prefer the mid-era albums I Am the Night and Power Metal to the sound that they developed well into the 90s. And since a lot of old glam terror records hasn't been reissued and they aren't available on Spotify or Apple Music, a lot of metal fans are quite unaware of that part of their discography. But now I'm curious to hear about your opinions on Pantera. Are you more of a glam terror or a groove terror fan? Let me know, and feel free to rank their full discography if you're familiar with it. And as always, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe with the bell notifications turned on. And if you want to support my work, then there's always the option to become a Patreon, like the Horsemen of the Apocalypse. Or why not go and grab yourself a shirt at the Ruthless Metal store. And I'm also on Patreon, Discord, Facebook and Twitter, if you want to check those out. And you can find all the necessary links listed down below. And I also want to say rest in peace to the Abbott brothers, Vinnie and Dimebag. And that's all for now, so thanks for watching, and I'll catch you guys in the next video. Bye bye.